just to recap very quickly, our first session, we talked about the establishment of America by the founders as a Christian nation, specifically by Christian men, to be a Christian nation, to create an environment where the worship of God was to be open and free. And I took you through 400 years of American history, and we delved into the founding documents of America that established clearly that America was founded as a Christian nation. And then when we were all finished with this presentation, we got the question, well, if America was founded by Christian men to be a Christian nation, why didn't they abolish slavery? And it's a very good question. It's a very important question. And frankly, it's a hard question because obviously slavery was America's sin. There's no question about that. And it was a great challenge, and it led to great distress, loss of life, not just the lives of the slaves over those horrific years they were enslaved, but through the Civil War, which was America's greatest scourge, frankly, with over 600,000 deaths and 1.2 million casualties as a result of that war on both sides, over not just slavery, the Civil War, but primarily slavery, no question about it. So the overarching question, why didn't the founders abolish slavery? The answer, frankly, is quite simple. It can be summed up in one simple sentence. And we're going to do that. We're going to sum it up in one simple sentence, but at the end of this presentation, I'm going to sum it up in one simple sentence. But let's start with a little bit of history of the world history of slavery. It is not true, friends, that slavery was driven by white men solely because of racism. It's not true that white racists invented slavery. The fact of the matter is that slavery has existed since the beginning of recorded time. There is history of slavery all throughout all of recorded history, and we can start with our own Bible for the proof of that. I'm looking at Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 6, of course, and it says, Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They're in Egypt now. The Israelites are living in Egypt at this time. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came into power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have come too far. They have become too numerous for us. Going on, verse 10, come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So verse 11, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses and as store cities for Pharaoh, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So why was Moses called to confront Pharaoh in Egypt? He was called to confront them because of the slavery. He was called specifically to confront Pharaoh, to challenge them to let his people go. If you go to chapter 2 now, verse 2, chapter 2, verse 23, rather. I'm chapter 2, verse 23. During the long period of enslavement, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of slavery went up to God. And God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So they were oppressed to the point of groaning, calling out for God, calling out to God for relief, and God sent Moses to Pharaoh. Going to chapter 3, verse 7 through 10. Chapter 3, verse 7 through 10, still in Exodus now. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land, out of that land into good and spacious land, a land overflowing with milk and honey. And so he goes on from there. So what we see here, friends, is a scriptural depiction of slavery that existed long before America was ever a country. And the fact of the matter is, slavery, as I said, existed throughout the entire world, not only at the time of Scripture, but up until the time of the founding of America as well. Every culture on the planet enslaved those people that it captured in battle. This went on in Babylon, in Persia, in Greece, in China, in India, in Africa. It happened everywhere in the world. The Romans made an art form out of it. They elevated slavery to an art form, and they leveraged it to its fullest extent, not just for slave labor. Of course, there was plenty of slave labor during the Roman Empire, but the Romans also used the intellectual power of its slaves to its own benefit as well. Highly educated Greeks were enslaved by the Romans in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and many of the Roman emperors used intelligent Greeks, or I should say educated Greeks, intelligent of course, but educated as well, for purposes of architecture and engineering and government planning and city planning and you know, all kinds of different reasons. The Romans used the Greeks as slaves, not just for physical labor. By the time Jesus walked the earth in the 1st century, Rome had a population of approximately 1,000 people, and historians put the population of slaves in Rome at 25 to 30% of the city. So this was a massive social existence at the time, and of course then slavery migrated to Western Europe in the later ages, and even in pre-Columbian America. The Native American tribes, they warred with each other on an ongoing basis and very commonly enslaved one another as a result of those wars. At the time of the Declaration of Independence, as I said, slavery was practiced everywhere in the world. And I want to give a little background now about slaves in America. First of all, let's understand something here, folks. What I'm presenting here is not a defense of slavery. I don't want there to be any confusion about this. The institution of slavery is indefensible. It's abhorrent. It's immoral. It's contrary to God's law. It's contrary to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, contrary to all those things. So let's not make any mistake about that. What I want to do is set the stage for what was going on in America in the 18th century and what the founders were confronted with. So slavery in the colonies didn't start in the typical sense that we understand it, where a strong man becomes an oppressor over a weaker person. That's not how it started. As of about 1630 in the United States, 90% of the quote unquote slaves in America at that time were really not slaves in the traditional sense. They were indentured servants. And what I mean by that is they made a voluntary contract relationship with somebody to work for them, to be their servant for a period of time in exchange for some valuable goods and services. In this particular case, it was very common for people to come from England to the colonies as bond servants, indentured servants. And they would do that specifically for the purposes of getting transportation from England to the New World. And then they would contract with their quote unquote benefactor. That's not exactly the right word, but they would contract with their sponsor. That is a better word. They'd contract with their sponsor to work for that person for 3 to 5 years, sometimes 7 years, and in a quote unquote bond servant relationship. And so they would get their transportation, their housing, their food, all of their clothing, all of their care for a stated period of time as a result of this servant relationship. All right, and so this is how it started. As I said, by 1630, about 90% of the quote-unquote slaves in America in the colonies at that time were bond servants, indentured servants. But by 1700, the numbers flipped. And the numbers flipped because slaves were being imported from different places around the world, and not just Africans, friends. It's important to understand that it's not just Africans that were brought to America. Certainly a lot of them were, no question about that. But in the mid-1600s, King James II and Charles I sold tens of thousands of Irish Catholics into slavery. They ended up in plantations. They ended up on plantations in the West Indies and Antigua, the Caribbean area, Barbados, Jamaica, and then the proclamation of King James I of 1625 sold Irish political prisoners into slavery and allowed English settlers in the New World to buy those slaves from these West Indian plantations. And so that's when white slaves started being brought into America at that time, and they were brought into Virginia and New England. So in 1620, there were fewer than 50 slaves, and I'm not talking about bond servants now, talking about outright slaves. In 1620, there were fewer than 50 slaves in the United States, but as a result of these activities, by 1750, there were 240,000 slaves, and by 1800, there was over 100,000 slaves in America. And by that time, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of those people were Black Africans, of course. Now, the Africans were being bought from slave markets throughout Africa and the Middle East. All right, so all across the continent of Africa, there were active slave markets going on in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was going on in North Africa, throughout the entire North African belt of nations, Tangiers, Morocco, Tripoli, modern day Libya, had very active slave markets. West Africa had a giant slave market in Sierra Leone. The Swahili coast in East Africa and Tanzania had slave markets, and of course the southern part, the Horn of Africa, and that also all through the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean, there were active slave markets going on. Where were these slaves coming from? These Black African slaves were coming from where? How was this happening that so many of these slaves were Black Africans? The narrative on slavery is driven by the idea of white racism, that whites enslaved Blacks because whites believe they're superior to Blacks. That's the narrative that's being driven. But that's not what the historical facts are. The slavery story, there is an element of the slavery story that nobody wants to talk about that has really been almost eviscerated from history. But I'm going to drill into that a little bit and give us some context here. And this is just so this is not a comfortable conversation necessarily, friends, but I think it's a conversation that has to happen in light of the push that's going on today with regard to the reparations argument. All right, so let's have a little bit of context here. As Islam pushed west, as the religion of Islam pushed west, it overthrew massive numbers of tribal governments throughout Africa and throughout the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, and west into the Near East. All right, in the 1400-year expansion of Islam, tens of millions of Africans were sold into slavery. Why did that happen? Because under the religion of Islam, what happens is those who don't convert to Islam are either killed or enslaved. And that's exactly what they were doing over this 1400-year push. All right, if you and so in Hugh Thomas's book, The Slave Trade, he mentions that between 1550 and 1800, about 1.5 million Christians were brought as slaves to Islamic North Africa, which is about 3 times more than the number of African slaves that were brought to America during the same period of time. The push of Islam did not just enslave Black people, it enslaved white people as well. All right, so under Islam, anybody who doesn't convert to the Islamic religion is legally entitled to be the slave of their captor in the Islamic wars. All right, so this begs a question. This is a little trick question. It's a lot of fun doing this live, but I'll ask you the question right now. Who was the first American president to fight Islam? Who was the first American president to fight Islam? Some people say it was Ronald Reagan. That would be a good guess, but they would be wrong. A lot of people say it was George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, as we like to call him in the trade. That would be a good guess as well, but that would be wrong. And I want to give you a little background. All right, in July of 1776, a remarkable thing happened. We all know that the Declaration of Independence was signed by the American colonies. They broke ties with England and became a nation unto itself. A second remarkable thing happened when the United States, when the colonies signed that declaration. They lost British naval protection. All right, the British stopped protecting American shipping on the high seas. All right, and so all of the American ships that were taking goods and services to England and through the Mediterranean were being attacked American shipping in the Mediterranean, West Africa, came under attack. Who were they attacked by? They were attacked by what we know today as the Barbary pirates. And these were people, these were sailors, mariners that were sailing under the flag of the Barbary nations, Algiers, Morocco, Tunisia, and Tripoli, all right? All of those nations that form the northern coast of Africa. All right, these were Muslim nations at the time, and the ships sailing under those flags were sailing throughout the Mediterranean and West Africa. And what they were doing, friends, is they were seizing the ships that were sailing in the area that were not Muslim ships. They were seizing the cargo of those ships, and they were seizing the people. All right, most of the men were killed or they were put into slave labor, and the women and children were almost always sold as slaves. And in the case of the women, of course, were sold primarily as sex slaves. Now, there was an alternative to being sold into slavery, and that was you could ransom those people out of slavery. And this is what was going on. The Barbary states were kidnapping, we're seizing these ships, kidnapping the people, either killing them, selling them into slavery, or selling them back to their home countries in exchange for ransom. In 1785, 2 American ships were hijacked by Algerian pirates. All right, the crews were forced into slave labor. At the time, Thomas Jefferson was in France, and he was an ambassador to France. At that time, John Adams, was in Britain, and he was an ambassador to Britain. These 2 men, American founders, met with Tripoli's ambassador in London. The government of Tripoli sent their ambassador to London to meet with Adams and Jefferson. Adams questions this ambassador. He says to him, "By what authority do you prey on our shipping? By what authority do you enslave our people? There's been no injury. There's been no insult. There's no war between our countries. There's no the rift here. What are you doing, and why are you doing this?" And the answer from the Tripoli ambassador was that we are in a state of war. He says very specifically to Adams, our countries are in a state of war. And Adams, of course, is flabbergasted because there's been no discussion whatsoever. There's been no transgression. There's been no insult. There's been no cause for war whatsoever. And Adams says this, "Well, what do you mean war? What are you talking about? How can we possibly be at war?" And here's what the response was of the Tripoli ambassador. He says, "It is written in the Quran that all nations who should not acknowledge their authority were sinners," the Muslims' authority, that is, were sinners, "that it was their right and duty to make war upon whoever they could find and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." This was the answer that was given by the Tripoli ambassador to London, face to face with Adams and Jefferson. All right, and then he went on and he warned them. He said, "War between Christians and Christians is mild," he says. "Prisoners were treated humanely, but war between Muslims and Christians would be horrible." All right, now Jefferson knew, now, of course, there was an alternative. The alternative was to buy peace. You could pay tribute to the government of Tripoli, and you could buy peace with Islam. Now, all right, so here's the Hobson's choice. We either buy peace or we continue to have our ships and our people and our cargo stolen. Now, Jefferson knew instinctively that any peace that was purchased at a price could never last. All right. He knew that it was impossible to maintain a peaceful relationship that was based on paying tribute. But the problem is the United States Navy had no navy with which to enforce a deal. So if they came to some conclusion with Tripoli, they had no capacity to enforce it. Jefferson wanted to build a fleet. Jefferson petitioned Washington. George Washington said, "We need to build a fleet, and we need to empower the United States to push back against this." And Jefferson specifically advised Washington to do that. And he said it was better to pay 10 times more to fight them than to pay tribute. Adams, on the other hand, wanted to pay them. He thought it was better to pay because of the loss of trade. He said it would be cheaper to pay them than to lose the trade that we will lose if we're in a fight with these people. And besides, he made the point that Jefferson made: we have no navy, we have no capacity to enforce this deal. We don't have the ability to hold their feet to the fire. So here's their Hobson's choice: do we build a navy and fight them, or do we pay them? Well, the decision was that the United States was going to pay tribute. And that started in 1785. But there was repeated violations of the treaties. They violated them over and over again, continued to seize American ships, cargo, and American people, and either ransoming them back or selling them into slavery or pushing them into slavery. By 1801, friends, listen to this now. By 1801, Jefferson's first term as president, the United States was paying 10% of its budget in tribute to the Barbary nations. 10% of the American budget was being paid out in tribute, but that wasn't enough. The ruthlessness continued, the piracy continued, and so did the debate. The debate went on and on and on. Do we fight or do we pay? Jefferson wanted to fight, but he didn't have the backing. They didn't have a navy. His attitude as president was, I would rather spend millions on defense, but not one penny for tribute. And besides the behavior, besides the piracy, besides the hijacking, Islam stood for the two things that Jefferson hated the most: tyrannical dictatorship and state-sponsored religion enforced by brutal violence. These are the two things that Jefferson abhorred more than anything else. In early 1801, Jefferson sent 4 ships to patrol North Africa on the pretense of enforcing the treaties. We're going to have 4 U.S. naval ships patrolling the coast there. One of those ships was the USS Constitution. Tripoli responded. Now remember, Tripoli believes America is weak, and frankly, at the time, America was weak. Tripoli responded by declaring war on the United States. That was they declared war on the United States. This happened in 1801. Morocco followed and also declared war on the United States, and both of those countries demanded even more tribute, even more payments, payoffs to not fight. The United States answered with their 4 frigates they had in the Mediterranean. They bombed the Tripoli harbor. They destroyed the fleet in the harbor, and they patrolled for 2 years, destroying vessels, destroying forts, destroying harbors along the way. But in 1803, a disaster occurred. And that disaster was the USS Philadelphia ran aground. When the Philadelphia ran aground, 300 crewmen were seized. 300 crewmen were seized and held captive in Tripoli, and a $3 million ransom was demanded for their return. There was a raid that was launched that rescued these men, and then in 1805, at the end of Thomas Jefferson's first term as president, the Marines got involved. Now, there was somebody on screen here a minute ago that was reciting the first couple of lines of the Marine Corps hymn. I wonder who that was. Well, we've all heard the Marine Corps hymn. We probably can't all sing it, and I don't expect that anybody should start singing it right now. But the Marine Corps hymn starts. To the shores of Tripoli. Okay, there we go. That was my son Nathan, who chimed in with the Marine Corps hymn. Nathan is a Marine. I'm sure we have a lot of Marines with us, and thank God for the Marines. I will say this about the Marines. Nathan has set the table for this, so we might as well make this point here. The Marines are crazy. They're just all crazy, and it's not the Marines that make them crazy. It's the Marines that attracts the crazy. But thank God they're all on our side. I love the Marines, obviously. But anyway, the Marines got involved, and we've heard from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Well, what do the shores of Tripoli have to do with the United States Marine Corps? In 1805, Marine Corps Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon and his sergeant and 6 other Marines, or a total of 6 United States Marines, led a team of 400 Egyptian mercenaries from Alexandria, Egypt, 600 miles across the desert to a place called Derna in Tripoli, again, modern-day Libya. All right, these mercenaries were described as a mutinous and motley crew of a ragtag band of mercenaries, guys that were paid to fight. But 8 Marines led 600 of these people across the desert, and they attacked the fort at Derna from the land, not the sea. It was a complete surprise. The Tripolian, the governments of Tripoli, the Navy was expecting a sea attack. The Marines came from behind through the land, and they destroyed that fort at Derna. The Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon was the first American to ever raise a flag on foreign soil as a result of a battle. All right, and this is where the shores of Tripoli phrase comes from in the United States Marine hymn. But things changed a little bit a few years later when America got bogged down with the British in 1812. Of course, we know about the War of 1812. America is now bogged down. By this time, America has a navy, however, and the piracy started again. All right, so the O'Bannon raid quieted things down for a number of years, but now America's bogged down with the British in this war, and by this time the piracy starts again. And now let's fast forward to 1815. This time Madison is the president of the United States. All right, so Madison is the president, and he sent, now what he did is he sent the well-developed United States fleet to Algiers. They destroyed the Algerian fleet in its harbor. The Algerians had to pay compensation. They had to release all the hostages, and not another dime of tribute was ever paid by the United States government to a foreign country to buy peace. Here's what Madison said, and it's become the settled policy of the United States to this day. Madison says, "It is a settled policy of America that as peace is better than war, war is better than tribute. The United States, while they wish for war with no nation, will buy peace with none." And that's exactly what happened. And this has been the policy. We've all heard this in the last 20 years. America doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Madison is the one that created that. Well, actually, Jefferson is the one that created that policy, but Madison is the one that cemented it with the United States Navy. All right, so that's the background on African slavery. Let's circle back now to American slavery and talk very specifically about American slavery and you know where that went and how our founders dealt with that. The importation of Africans as slaves in America began in earnest in the last half of the 1600s, and this was the time at which these African slave markets began to flourish. By 1700, however, talking about 1700, now remember the Civil War started in 1860, so this is 160 years before the Civil War started. Pastors from all Christian denominations at this point in time in America were speaking out very specifically against slavery policies, and they were demanding the abolition of slavery amongst their congregations. All right, and in particular, in 1693, the Quaker Church was officially against slavery. They stood against slavery in its belief, in its statements of belief, and in all of their congregations. And they were against slavery in general and the further importation of slaves into the United States in particular. The leading case against slavery, friends, I know none of you have heard of this book, but it's really not even a book. The leading case against slavery was published in Boston in 1700. It was written by a Massachusetts judge by the name of Samuel Sewall. And the book is entitled The Selling of Joseph. It's referred to as a book, but it's not really a book. It's more like a pamphlet. It's not much bigger than one of Paul's epistles. But what it does is it makes the case that slavery is immoral from the standpoint of God's law. Sewall's book, The Selling of Joseph, criticizes and indicts slavery, and 100% of Sewall's authority is the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. All the way through his treatise, he cites verse after verse opposing slavery. And his case is based on the idea that all people have equal rights to liberty, that all people born under God are God's children and God's creation, and they all enjoy the right to life that was granted by God and the right to liberty that goes along with the right to life. All right, so he refuted the case for slavery. And in fact, there was about 4 or 5 common arguments that were used at the time to quote unquote defend slavery. And one of those common arguments, ironically, was the idea that because the African slaves were captured by their own people in those Islamic wars and then sold into slavery, that somehow it was okay to purchase these people because they were already prisoners of war anyway. And of course, Sewall refuted that with scripture and with the proposition that it's immoral. I mean, he equated it to buy stolen goods. It's immoral to buy stolen goods. Just because somebody steals something out of your house doesn't give somebody else the right to buy it on the marketplace. All right, and so this was the one of the attacks that Sewall made on slavery in his pamphlet, The Selling of Joseph. The Selling of Joseph is available on the internet. You can download. You can go do the Google search and find it. It's a fascinating read. So moving forward now, the Quakers, the Moravians, the Methodists, they all actively pressed for abolition of slavery through their congregations, and they argued that natural human rights exist apart from civil government. Now listen to this, friends. This is a very important concept that they were arguing in 1700. Natural civil rights exist apart from civil government. All right, natural human rights exist apart from civil government. You have a right to life. You have the right to liberty. You have the right to property. These rights don't exist because government granted them to you. Government exists, and this is clear in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which we talked about at length in our first session. Governments are instituted among men to protect these rights. Government doesn't create the rights. Government doesn't grant the rights. Government exists to protect rights. God is the source of these rights. God is the source of life. God is the source of liberty. God gives us our minds and our creativity by which we produce property and therefore have the right to own property, all right? This concept was expressed by these Christian denominations in the 1700s that later became expressed very clearly by Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, all right? This is the concept of natural law that they were arguing at this time. Natural law is God's law, and natural law creates your right to life and your right to liberty. And this extends, this is important, this extends to every human being. The right to life and liberty extends to every human being. And so, friends, through this process of arguing these points to their congregations, the Quakers and the Methodists peacefully and voluntarily abolished slavery in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey 100 years before the first shot of the Civil War was ever fired. All right, so there was a strong movement in America and the colonies before the Declaration was ever signed to push for the abolition of slavery. It was done through the church. It was done through Christian argument and through Christian education and by Christian pastors imploring their congregation to move away from the sin of slavery. And that's what they did. Now, here's the thing that's fascinating. And this is what the modern church has gotten away from, friends. They did it under the threat of expulsion from the church. Now, we know it's scriptural, friends, that if you've got a loved one, a friend, a loved one that's involved in some kind of sin, whether it's adultery or, just go down the list, whatever it may be, we have a responsibility as Christians, not to indict them for it, not to condemn them for it, but to sit down and help them face the facts. If you've got a loved one that's involved, what we do as Christians is we sit down and we say, look, here's what's going on. These are the likely negative consequences of your behavior. In other words, in a loving and kind way, we challenge them and call them out, right? We call them to repentance. That's what we do. And it's a legitimate and a necessary Christian function. And what these 18th century churches were doing, friends, is they were calling their congregation to repentance from the sin of slavery under the threat of being expelled from the church. If you're going to continue with this sin, you can't be a member of the church. All right, this is the challenge I have for the Catholic Church, frankly. Supposedly, I mean, we're getting a little bit astray here, but I'm going to make one. You know what? I'm not even going to go there because we're going to talk about this later on anyway. So forget all that. So it was the church that was pushing this. It was the church that was making this case. Now, I want to make one side comment here. So the abolitionist movement in the United States was founded by and pressed by Christians, Christian men that recognized the sin of slavery and knew that it had to be washed out of society. There is never, friends, there's never been a significant or relevant abolitionist movement within Islam, never. Muslim slave markets exist to this day. They continue to enslave people in Muslim worlds, particularly women, captured women, many of whom are still are Christians. And it's estimated that there's 30 to 40 million slaves currently in the world today, most of them living in Muslim nations. So this is some context. So now let's ask this question. Why did the colonies break ties with England in the first place? What was the reason the colonies finally said to King George, enough is enough? Well, the primary answer we get, which isn't wrong, by the way, the primary answer we get when I ask this question is, well, America, the colonies, broke ties with England over the concept of taxation without representation. You know, and there's no question about the fact that taxation without representation was a huge issue. The Townshend Acts that were passed in 1740, 1750, that were strangling American commerce was a huge problem. The Excise Tax Acts that were imposed by England were a huge problem. And frankly, the tax on tea was the smallest of them. It was just the easiest one for the colonists to protest, to send a message to England, and hence the Boston Tea Party. But the fact of the matter is the Declaration of Independence makes an entire list of the allegations of injustice that were performed by the king against the colonies. And in the Declaration of Independence, this list of wrongs, this list of violations that the king was imposing on the colonies is referred to by Jefferson as repeated injustices and usurpations. Taxation is only one of them. All right, it's only one thing on the list. And friends, it's not even in the top 10. All right, the total number of indictments that are in the Declaration of Independence against England, there's 27 of them, 27 separate charges of wrongdoing by the king against the colonies, which Jefferson says has their object to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. Taxation without representation is 17th on the list. It's not even in the top 10. So that begs the question, what's number one on the list? What was the number one complaint the colonists had as expressed in the Declaration against King George? Number one, he, the king, has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. What is he talking about? He's talking about the king's practice of vetoing legislation that was passed by the colonists. Even though the colonists had their own elected representatives, and they had their own governors. Mostly those governors were imposed by England on the colonies, but the legislatures were elected. Even though they had their own legislators and their own governors, the king had a veto power over all laws that were passed by the colonies. The king himself could say yes or no to any law that was passed. And the king continuously vetoed laws that were passed by the colonies to free slaves and stop the slave trade in the United States. Before the Declaration of Independence, there was repeated moves, particularly by the northern states, to outlaw slavery in the colonies and stop the trade. And the king intervened repeatedly and stopped that legislation from taking effect. All right. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence contained a very strong and specific condemnation of the slave trade, which got watered down. And the reason it got watered down particularly is because the 13 colonies knew, that the representatives of the 13 colonies knew that there had to be a unanimous stand against England in order for this thing to work. If there was one person, or if there was one colony that was not on board with the whole package, then this would not work. And so what they did is they watered down Jefferson's original language. But listen to this original statement in the Declaration of Independence that Jefferson wrote. Let me back up a step and say one of the reasons that King George was vetoing this stuff, friends, which nobody knows, that a fact that's been lost in history, is King George directly and personally participated in the slave trade. You see, King George was a principal in a company known as the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company was a slave trading company. It was a company that ran ships between North African and West African slave markets, particularly West African slave markets in Sierra Leone, would buy these slaves from the Muslim slave traders that captured them in the first place, send them to the West Indies, and quote unquote season the slaves in the West Indies, and then sell them back into the colonies at the time. King George was personally involved in that activity through the Royal African Company. So here's Jefferson's language in the Declaration that talks about this fact. And this is a quote now from the original text of the first draft of the Declaration. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thereto. Suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, determining to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. So here Jefferson is saying, we're trying to stop this, and the king won't let us stop it. Franklin noted later on that there was a broad disposition among the founders of the United States to abolish slavery, that they wanted abolished in North America, but the king wouldn't let them do it. All right, Pennsylvania Quakers freed slaves and abolished slavery. Virginia continued to petition the king to stop the importation of slaves. There were a number of manumission laws that were passed by the various colonies during this period of time. A manumission law, by the way, is a law that allows a slave owner to freeze slaves under certain circumstances. If I die, my slaves can be free. After 10 years, my slaves can be free. These are manumission laws, right? And all of those laws were vetoed by the king. After the Declaration of Independence was signed, all right, remember, it was signed in July of 1776. After the Declaration of Independence was signed, one of the first things that the vast majority of northern states did was pass their own laws to abolish slavery, which the king could not veto. All right, this occurred before the United States Constitution ever was signed, ever was ratified in 1789. All right, so after 1776, we have Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont. Vermont did it in 1777, and then New Hampshire, all of them, every single one of them abolished slavery in their states as one of the very first things they did after the Declaration was signed. There were two court cases that occurred very shortly after the Declaration of Independence was signed that happened in Massachusetts. And these two court decisions in Massachusetts essentially abolished slavery in Massachusetts. It sounded the death knell for slavery. The first one occurred in 1780, and the second one occurred in 1781. All right, the 1780 case is a case called Commonwealth versus Jennison. Jennison was a slave owner. Jennison was charged with a crime. Remember, this is 1780 now. He was charged with a crime of A, assaulting a man, and B, holding him as unlawful imprisonment. All right, now, the man that he was alleged to have beaten and held as unlawful imprisonment was his slave. Right, the guy was a slave. In the case of, and it was ruled in this case that Jennison had Jennison had a right to freedom, and it was illegal for that Jennison's slave had a right to freedom, and that Jennison had no right to hold this man in custody as a slave. It was based on the Massachusetts Constitution and the Statement of Rights that was in the Constitution. And the Massachusetts Constitution was mostly written by John Adams. And in the Statement of Rights, Adams makes the statement that all men are born free and equal. And that is the clause that the state of Massachusetts used to prosecute Jennison for beating the slave and holding him captive. And the slave was declared a free man as a result of that. In 1781, there were two slaves, a person named Brom and a person named Bet, that sued their quote-unquote master for freedom. All right, so that's the case of Brom and Bet versus Ashley. And that case also was based squarely on the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights, that all men are born free and equal. All right, so these two cases were ratified by the court, 1780 and 1781, and it was clear from these two legal decisions that the institution of slavery would have no support in Massachusetts whatsoever, no support under the law. And as a result of that, by 1790, we're talking about 70 years before the Civil War ever broke out, there were no slaves, 0 slaves in Massachusetts by this time, because of the actions of these Christian men to abolish this. The Congress of the Confederation, we talked about this in our first session. In 1787, the Congress of the Confederation passed the so-called Northwest Ordinance. As I said before, and you might recall this, the Northwest Ordinance is the only act of Congress, only act that was passed twice in its exact form, word for word, by Congress. First by the Congress of the Confederation, 1789, and second by the Congress of the United States. Or the first was 1787, and the second time was 1789 by the Congress of the United States. All right, so I gave you the trivia question last time. Why would they pass 2 laws exactly the same back to back? Well, the first one was under the Articles of Confederation. The second one was under the Constitution. The Northwest Ordinance created a new territory in the United States, and that is the territory which would eventually become the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. They were admitted to the Union later on. Article 4, friends, of the Northwest Ordinance, passed twice, says there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So the Northwest Ordinance abolished slavery as a matter of law in these new territories. All of these territories, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, were all admitted to the Union as non-slave states. The founders knew, there's no question that the founders knew that slavery was completely inconsistent with the concepts of the Declaration, and they were completely inconsistent with God's law. Remember, the Declaration makes the very specific statement that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the essence of the freedom message that was created by the Declaration. But by 1787, when the Constitution was ratified, slavery was heavily ingrained in American society at this point. It was existing on the continent for 150 years by this time. The American founders didn't abolish slavery, friends, and they didn't sanction slavery. They did what they could do to abolish slavery under the circumstances, given that this institution was so heavily ingrained in the culture by this time. And frankly, it was a product not of American Christians or colonial Christians. It was a product, at least the African slavery on American continent was the product of British and Dutch governments trading with Muslim warlords who were selling off their prisoners of war through the Islamic wars. It was the Christians in America who worked to abolish slavery, and they did through the steps that are mentioned above, and also by establishing a provision in the United States Constitution that abolished the slave trade in this country. Now, friends, I would challenge you. I don't believe there's any other country in the world that has, as part of its Constitution, the abolition of the slave trade, but the United States Constitution has a provision to abolish the slave trade, and most people don't even know that. It's Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution gave Congress the power to prohibit the migration and importation of such persons as the states may seem fit to import. Well, the states were seeing fit to, at least some of them, were seeing fit to import African slaves, and Article 1, Section 9 gave Congress the power to abolish that practice, all right? It's specifically pointed at the importation of slaves. Jefferson pushed the legislation through Congress that would lead to the law abolishing the slave trade. So the Constitution gave Congress the authority to abolish it. Jefferson pushed Congress for the statute that would in fact abolish it. On December 2nd, 1806, he argued to the Congress for the passage of such a law. And here's what he said: withdrawal of the United States from all further participation in these violations of human rights, which have been so long continued on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa, in which the morality, reputation, and the best interests of our country have long been eager to proscribe. In other words, Congress, we need to step up. Morally and legally, we need to step up and get this done. Now, under the constitutional provision, this ban could take effect as of in 1808. In March of 1807, pursuant to Jefferson's urging in December of 06, Congress passed the law to ban the importation of slaves. Jefferson signed the bill Sunday morning, January 1st, 1808, the very first day he had the constitutional authority to do it. He didn't waste 1 minute signing that bill into law that prohibited the importation of slaves from that day forward. All right, this ended that's what ended the importation of slaves into the United States. It was that bill that Jefferson signed. Jefferson knew that slavery was immoral and repugnant. He knew it had to be abolished. He criticized it sharply, and he set forth to abolish it as best he could. And here is one of the comments that Jefferson made with respect to this. This is Jefferson. He says, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought to be secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath?" He says, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, and that considering the numbers and nature and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune, an exchange of situation is possible among all events, and it may become probable that by supernatural interference," he was talking about the turning of tables of slavery against their against their slave owners. All right, now, America is blamed for slavery, friends, but the fact of the matter is America took significant steps to abolish the slave trade. When you're locked in your house and you can't go anywhere, and the only thing you can do is more research, I did some research on the specific laws that were passed by Congress with respect to the slave trade, generally speaking, all right? Not just the one I talked about that abolished the importation of slaves. In 1794, in March of 1794, the Slave Trade Act of 1794 was signed by President Washington, which prohibited any American from being involved internationally in the slave trade. All right, so it made it a crime for U.S. citizens, individuals in the United States, to be involved in international slave trade. That was even before the abolition of the importation of slaves. In 1798, there was the act that created the Mississippi Territory, banned the importation of slaves from foreign countries into that area. This was even before the Article 1, Section 9 proscription that we just talked about a minute ago. In 1800, the Slave Trade Act of 1800 was signed into law by President John Adams. This prohibited all U.S. citizens from engaging in any international slave trade in other countries, not just on the water, right? But anywhere in the world. All right. It also prohibited the ownership of any slave trade vessel, and it allowed U.S. vessels to seize slave vessels. And anybody who seized a slave vessel was entitled to the fruits of the seizure. They could keep the ship and the cargo. Of course, the people had to be set free. In 1803, various states, and I didn't make a list of them, various states passed all kinds of laws to prohibit the slave trade. These are not in my notes, by the way. This is the result of being locked up in the house here. So in 1807, March of 1807, nearly 1 year before the constitutional authority existed to abolish the slave trade, Congress passed a law abolishing the importation of slaves, and they imposed stiff fines and prison sentences and forfeiture of ships for anybody that was involved in the slave trade. In 1818, that law, Congress changed that law, and they stiffened up the penalties. All right, and any person in possession of a slave at this time had a burden of proof. All right, The possession of a slave was deemed to be illegal unless you could prove that that slave was in the United States for more than 5 years. In 1819, the Congress authorized the use of armed vessels to cruise the U.S. coast, the African coast, and to interdict all slave traders that were involved in the activity. All right, the slaves were returned to Africa, and all of the bounties that were, and the ships and the cargo and so forth that were seized were basically bounties that were paid to the hunters. In fact, these were called the African Squadron. All right, so you can check this out. And then in 1820, the Congress of the United States declared that anybody involved in the slave trade was a pirate, and the penalty for piracy was death. All right, so this is the pattern that the Congress followed here as we went forward. So, you know, this was all based on the idea that they knew it was immoral, that it could not continue, that it had to stop. Abraham Lincoln, friends, referred to the Equality Clause of the Constitution as the crowning jewel of American liberty. He pointed to God's word in all of his debates on the question. He pointed to God's word, the Bible, as the legal authority and as the moral authority, and the Declaration of Independence as the legal authority for the abolition of slavery. And it happened, but only after Jefferson's worst fears were realized, that the country was virtually torn apart as a result of this sin. In 1893, a Portuguese slave ship loaded up a cargo of, quote unquote, cargo of African slaves that they purchased from the slave market in Sierra Leone. And it was being transported to Cuba on a Spanish ship by the name of La Amistad. And you might have heard of the name La Amistad before, and you'll realize why in a minute here. Cuba was then a Spanish colony, and slavery was legal at that in that colony. A twist of events, a very unusual twist of events, brought the Amistad, instead of to Cuba, it ended up in Boston Harbor. And as a result of these laws that I talked about a minute ago, there was a legal fight over whether the ship could be forfeited, and the stores of the ship forfeited, and the African passengers on the ship, not passengers, the slaves on the ship were to be returned to Africa from whence they were stolen. And there was a legal fight over this, and this case went to the United States Supreme Court over how this was going to play out. John Quincy Adams argued the case before the United States Supreme Court in 1841. And he said to the Supreme Court, the moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has the equal right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. I ask nothing more on behalf of these unfortunate men than this declaration. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story wrote the opinion of the court. The opinion of the court was 7-1 in favor of the Africans. Story said there is no doubt that they should be free, and they were released and allowed to go back to their homes. I'm talking about the case of the United States versus the schooner Amistad, which is the 1841 decision. There was a movie made called Amistad, and if you haven't seen it, you should. It's a great movie, and it's quite remarkably accurate, in fact. Question is, who's Joseph Story? We're going to bring this in for a landing here now. I got just a couple of minutes of notes here to finish up with. Who is Joseph Story? Joseph Story wrote the opinion of the court, as I said. Joseph Story was on the Supreme Court from 1811 to his death in 1845. He was the youngest member. He was the youngest person ever appointed as a justice of the Supreme Court. Story was never a chief justice, but he was a very prominent justice. He was a devout Christian. Joseph Story wrote the Supreme Court's decision in Vidal versus Girard's Executors, and this is an 1844 decision that declared that Bible reading in public schools and Bible reading in schools in general was absolutely allowable and encouraged. And in fact, here's what he said about this now. He says, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the college, its general principles expounded, its evidence explained, its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principle of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? All right, this was an opinion of the Supreme Court that Joseph Story wrote in 1844. He founded the Harvard University Law School. He is the author of a magnificent set of books called the Commentaries on the United States Constitution. Joseph Story's commentaries on the Constitution, friends, were required reading in every law school in the United States up until the turn of the 20th century, about 1910, 1920. About that time is when they started using these stopped using these as law school references. It's about the same time they stopped using the common law treatise, Blackstone's commentaries on the common law as textbooks as well, which is one of the reasons why the law profession has gone south the way it has. The Story's commentaries on the Constitution are still regarded as the most authoritative subject on the Constitution that's ever been written. And Story talks about the slave trade, and he talks about the United States interdicting the slave trade in the Constitution through Article 1, Section 9. And here's what he says about this now. And let's keep this in the context now of the accusations that America is at fault when it comes to slavery. All right, let's keep Story's comments in context. He says, let it be remembered, at this period, this horrible traffic was carried on with the encouragement of support of every civilized nation of Europe, and none with more eagerness and enterprise than by the parent country, England. America, listen to this, friends. America stood forth alone, uncheered and unaided in stamping ignominy on this traffic on the very face of her constitution of government, although there were strong temptations of interest to draw her aside from the performance of this great moral duty. And then he goes on, he concludes, he says, it is to the honor of America, it is to the honor of America that she should have set this example of interdicting and abolishing the slave trade in modern times. It is to the honor of America that our Christian founders abolished this slave practice. So the opening question, friends, why didn't the founders abolish slavery? Why didn't the founders abolish slavery? The answer is they did. They did abolish slavery. They worked hard on an ongoing basis to abolish slavery. God's word was the moral authority for doing it. The Declaration of Independence was the legal authority for doing it. Together, these two things were the dynamite that were planted under the structure of slavery. It was put there by Christians specifically to abolish this practice and disinfect society from this horrible practice. And Jefferson was the one who lit the fuse. American Christian founders did abolish slavery. The end.